Settle down. This is the last substantive new content lecture which I shall be giving. The second lecture this morning will be a revision lecture. A word of apology in advance. My voice is giving out. I feel slightly under the weather. If I ramble on more than usual, please forgive me. And if my voice just can't take the strain and I end up by whispering, all move to the front. Before I start, can I ask if anyone's got any questions they want to ask? Any general questions or specific questions? Because one or two people may be coming in slightly late. So just before I begin, are there any questions? None? That means I begin. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the 20th century. The 20th century. The development of modern psychology. And particularly, I'll be looking at two movements which were very, very important in 20th century psychology. Behaviourism and Gestalt psychology. Behaviourism originating from America, and Gestalt psychology, the 20th century continuation of some of the ideas taken from Wilhelm Wundt in Germany. As I say, these were the two major movements of psychology in the 20th century. And they had very, very different images of what psychology should be about. Different images, if you want, about human nature and what was important about humans. Different images of science. Often thought to be very incompatible. And by considering these two movements, and by comparing them and putting them in their history, we raise the question of what sort of psychology do we want? What should be the topic of psychology? Should we choose more of a behaviourist view or more of a Gestalt view? Or in fact reject both of them? Oh, I've forgotten the attendance register. And if any of you ask, why every week, every lecture do you have to have an attendance register? Let me say now, it's imposed upon universities. You saw what happened to London Metropolitan University when it lost its ability to teach students from overseas. It was because it wasn't taking an attendance register. It wasn't keeping check on students who didn't attend, bogus students. So it's not that I want to know exactly who's been attending which lecture. It's by law now. If we want to teach overseas students, and I see no reason why my pearls of wisdom should just be confined to students from a European community, but we have to have these attendance registers. Sorry, I didn't plan to say that, but I have. Behaviourism. It's really associated with two figures. John Watson and B.F. Skinner, both Americans. Watson was the earlier and Skinner was like a pupil of Watson. and very much an American movement in psychology. And in the first half of the 20th century, and indeed probably until the 1970s, it was the dominant way of doing psychology. And then it's faded out, but it has left its residue. And above all, when it first started, in the early years of the 20th century, it claimed, particularly Watson, claimed it to be a new way of doing psychology. And its big claim was not just that it was new, but at last psychology was properly scientific. And so there was an image of science in this new movement. And as I outline some of the assumptions of behaviourism, I'll be particularly drawing on John Watson's essay, Psychology as the Behaviourist Views It. And I think I've put that on the reading list and a link to where you can read the paper in its original. And it really became a manifesto for this new psychology, behaviourism. And to understand behaviourism, I think you really need to understand what it was a rebellion against, what it didn't like, and above all, it didn't like Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt, as I've lectured before, devised experiments, many experiments. He was indefatigable, untiring in his pursuit of experiments. But above all, in his experiments, he sought to use what is called introspectionism. Introspection, inspection, you look inside. You look inside to see what you're experiencing. And for Wundt, experiments gave a systematic way of investigating consciousness and inner life. And when he meant inner life, he meant the inner life we're aware of, what our senses perceive. Not the inner life of Freud, which is beyond what we can perceive or feel. And behaviourism said this idea of Wundt's and his followers, many of whom have got jobs in the United States, was wrong. But introspectionism, looking inside yourself, taking note of your experiences, was misguided because above all, it was unscientific. That introspectionism, Wundt had failed to establish psychology as a proper naturalistic science. Behaviourists wanted to put psychology up there with physics and chemistry and engineering, above all engineering actually. But they said, this will never happen so long as you keep doing Wundt's experiments and think that really the methodology of psychology is to look in at yourself and try and catch your own consciousness. And what they said is, it's a mess. When Watson looked at the results of Wundt's laboratory and other laboratories in Germany, he said, it's a mess. There's no consistent findings. The debates go, some say we can think without mental images, others say we have to have mental images. Some say, well, what is the colour we see? Is my perception of red the same as your perception of red, or the same as your perception of red, or do you see a slightly different shade? You can't resolve it all. It's just blather, blather, blather. We need a different sort of way of doing scientific research. This is going to be a dead end. And Watson was quite rude about Wundt's sort of psychology. He thought the problem both methodological and conceptual. The conceptual problem is that the Wundt people were looking at the wrong things. That psychology shouldn't be the study of consciousness. And he certainly didn't think that Watson didn't think that it should be the study of unconsciousness. If the new behaviourist, if Watson was against Wundt and his Leipzig style of psychology, he was so much more against Freudianism. Actually, there are good personal reasons why Watson would have found Freud's theory just bizarre. Do you want a bit of gossip of why Watson would have found Freud's theory bizarre? Yes, I think yes. Freud was arguing that the cause of all our distress is because we are repressed sexually. We have these sexual desires which we cannot admit to. Watson, an American, much more open in his life than Freud, would have found this absolutely bizarre because there is absolutely no evidence from any of the biographers of Watson that he was repressed sexually in any way whatsoever. He seemed to have serial affairs, one after another, with all young ladies. Any young lady who came near Watson, Watson would be after them, and he was quite successful for a while until he became unemployable in American universities, because they realised they couldn't leave young female students in his company without scandals, and he had to go and make his livelihood in commerce rather than universities. He was sucked. So you can imagine someone like this wouldn't say, oh, the root of all psychological behaviour is sexual repression, because he'd say, well, what on earth is going on? Anyway, that's my gossip. And Watson said that the real study of psychology should not be the inner life, whether conscious or unconscious. It should be the outer life. It should be behaviour, what we can see, not what you have to ask someone else to report, not the study of mental behaviour. And the assumption is that humans, just like animals, have to adjust to their environment. Put humans in any environment, they have to adjust to it. And the subject of psychology should be to observe how people adjust to the environment. Watch them adjusting. Watch animals adjusting. And this was something which was fundamental to behaviourism, which is you could use the same methods for studying animals as for humans. For Wundt sort of introspectionism, that's not true. You can't put an animal in a laboratory and flash lights on them and say, do you see the difference between that light and the other? And expect a pigeon to say, no, I don't think I can see it. Pigeons can't talk. The sort of experiments which Wundt was doing needed someone who could talk. So you couldn't do them on animals. Watson was saying, watch humans, watch animals, and often it's easier to watch animals. and especially if you want to do experiments, because you can alter the environment with animals much more easily than altering the environment with humans. You can make animals hungry and then see what they will do to get food. There are ethical objections to starving even students. And the aim was to acquire knowledge, above all, to predict and to control patterns of adjustment. When would someone do this? When wouldn't they? What sort of rewards do you have to give someone in order for them, or an animal, for them to produce this sort of behaviour as opposed to that sort of behaviour? And science was to observe behaviour and, above all, to control behaviour. Because if you can see the pattern which leads to a particular sort of behaviour, then the psychologist can learn to control people by giving them this pattern of the environment, to construct the environment in this way rather than that way, and to observe how people will adjust to the environment. Now, for Watson, it was so important to be scientific. How to be scientific? Quite simple. You observe outward behaviour and you try and control the environment of the organism you're studying, whether it's a human or an animal, and you vary that environment systematically. You give them a reward every 12 times they press a button, or every 10 times they press a button. And you see how the subject behaves in relation to these slight changes of the environment. You're not interested in what the subject is thinking. It doesn't matter what the subject is thinking, or even if the subject isn't thinking, it's how the subject behaves. And one thing about behaviourism, which is often forgotten, the behaviourists typically studied individuals, whether it was an individual pigeon, an individual rat, or an individual student. They didn't tend to use aggregate data, at least in the classic studies. Skinner would report how a pigeon had learned to pack this key, been taught to pack this key, not this key to get his food. And they would present graphs about the pigeon being, an individual pigeon being trained to move to the right as opposed to move to the left. And when I said in last week about Danziger's study of the journals, that even by the 1950s there were still studies of individual data rather than aggregate data in some of the American journals, it wasn't because old Wundtians were still existing, it was because many of the new studies of the new psychology used individual data. Although as behaviourism grew, so increasingly aggregate data was used. But in the early years, there was no thought that to be scientific, you had to use groups, and to be scientific, you had to use statistics. Now, there was also, with the conceptual change, a different vocabulary. It's one of the things about modern psychology, is that when a psychologist says, oh, I've got a new approach, I've got a new theory, this is the way to do psychology, they nearly always come up with a new word and say, if you want to be scientific, these are the words you have to use. And certainly this was true of behaviourism. And it wasn't just use these words, it was, and there's a whole set of words which psychologists have traditionally used which you mustn't use. There was a taboo against using the sorts of vocabulary which Wundt used. And Watson said, we don't want to use any word which stands for a mental process. Because we're studying behaviour. We're studying what can be observed. And we need words for behaviour and outward things. Here's a quote from Watson. The time seems to have come, notice this, the time seems to have come. And anyone who thinks their ideas now are the modern ideas use phrases like this. When psychology must, not could, but must discard all reference to consciousness. When it need no longer delude itself into thinking that it is making mental states the object of observation. Delude itself. Why did he say delude itself? Delude itself by making mental states the objects of observation, because you can't observe a mental state. You can only, according to Watson, observe outward behaviour. So if you say, I want a psychology of the mind, you delude yourself into thinking you can observe the mind, according to Watson. So, he said, the psychologist must not use any words which seem to indicate mental things. Mental terms like consciousness, mental states, mind, content, introspectively verifiable imagery, that was a very Wundtian phrase, and the like. And Watson forbade any of his students from using terms like mind or mental. And instead you use terms such as stimulus, stimuli, responses, habit formations, outward things, terms which are defined in terms of actions or experimental procedures which can be outwardly observed. It's a movement from a psychology of the inner state to a psychology of the outward behaviour. And the term can apply to humans and animals alike. You describe the pigeon in exactly the same way as you would describe the human. And that means getting rid of all the complicated terminology about states of mind, states of feeling, or whatever. A very barren view of the human being. The human like a pigeon. And it was very popular. It was very popular because it seemed to provide a technology of how you can change people's behaviour. If you can train a pigeon, as Skinner did, to play ping pong, then with more complicated schedules of reinforcement and stimuli, you can train humans to do what you want them to do. You could train criminals to be not criminals. If only you could discover the right schedule of reinforcement for that individual. But what Watson and Skinner were saying is, don't look inside. Treat everyone as if they're blank. Well, the big opposition to behaviourism during the early years of the 20th century and throughout the first half of the 20th century were the Gestalt psychologists. And actually, in the United States, the Americans The behaviourists seem to have it their own way until the rise of Nazism. Why should this be of effective then? Because many of the Gestaltists then had to flee to America, and they introduced Gestaltist notions to America. They were often greeted with amusement at first, but the Gestalt ideas took root. And the Gestaltists claimed to have discovered not the laws of behaviour, which the behaviourists were looking for, but the laws of thinking. The Gestaltists were interested in the very things which Watson said no properly scientific psychologist should be interested in. And the three big important figures of Gestalt psychology, all born in Germany: Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, Wolfgang Köhler. Koffka and Köhler ended up in the States. Koffka, like Köhler, did research on how humans make decisions, how they get insight, how they understand problems. Koffka himself needed this insight. Bit of gossip now, bit of gossip. You'd think that someone who did research in how the mind makes decisions, how it solves problems, would be able to solve the problems of his own life. Well, did he? He married one woman, was together for a number of years, and then taught a much younger woman, a student. Oh, and the heart beat loudly, and he fell in love with the young student and ditched the old wife. A common story, Watson would have understood that. And he was with the young woman for a while, and then he realised what he'd missed and went back to the old wife, married her again for a second time. And then the same thing happened again. The same young, not quite so young student. And he divorced the wife for the second time and married his former student for the second time. Ah, dear, there's someone who couldn't sort things out. But all of them developed Wundt's interest in the higher mental processes and developed Wundt's idea that a good psychology needs a theory about the active mind, how we make sense of the world. Not just how we behave in the world, but how we make sense of things. How do our minds work? And this, for Watson, was heresy. The big problem for the Gestaltists: how does the mind work? Can we formulate a law for the mind? And at root, they said yes. And the big principle, the big law, is the importance of holes. That's holes with a W, not holes in the ground, things which are totals, patterns. Or the German term for a pattern, a Gestalt. Don't break things down into their constituent elements. Look for the wider pattern, because this is what our minds do. And it was illustrated by something, a problem which Wertheimer, the early Gestaltist, wrote about and said exemplified the human mind. Take a tune which is played in two separate keys, or a song which is sung by someone with a high voice and someone with a low voice. I wish I could illustrate it to you, but I cannot sing a tune, I cannot hold a tune. if we had a male and a female student who would like to sing the first line of Happy Birthday to You, that would be wonderful. Especially if the male had a deep voice and the female had a higher voice. Are there two extroverts who'd like to do that? Oh no. Then you'll have to imagine it. Imagine I'm singing Happy Birthday to You, and then I get someone else to sing Happy Birthday to You. There wouldn't be a single stimulus in common. No note in common between the two. If I sing down here Happy Birthday, all the sounds are different than someone singing the same tune up in a high range. And if we made sense of the world by putting together stimulus against stimulus and noticing the same stimulus occurring again, we would never be able to recognise the same tune sung by someone in the bass and someone who's a tenor. Do you understand that? Why? Because they don't contain any element which is the same. Are you with me? Okay. But people don't find it difficult to recognise the same tune played in different keys. And this is the problem. Why don't we? And what does this tell us about the human mind? If each note is different, but nevertheless we instantly recognise it as the same tune. And the answer is, this can only happen if instinctively we put elements together into wholes, whole patterns. And what we recognise is the relationships between the individual elements, and then can notice that same relationship occurring again when someone sings the same tune but in a different key. That what is the difference between the similarity between Happy Birthday sung down here and Happy Birthday sung up here is the relationship between the individual elements. It's the same patterning of relationships, not any individual element in common. And for Wertheimer, he said, that is so important. We take it almost for granted, but we can hear the same tune, even though the two versions of the same tune contain no individual element which is similar, the same. And why? Because we think in terms of patterns, not individual elements. And the Gestaltists did a lot of work on visual perception to show this. They said that the visual system works by grouping things together, not by seeing an individual element, but by seeing patterns. And we do this unthinkingly. There's a law of grouping, a law of forming good gestalts, good patterns. Look at this. Can you see these 8 stars? Tell me what you see. Do you see 8 individual stars? No, what is it? You shook your head. So what is it you see? 4, yes, 4 groups of 2 in a line. And to do that, you associate that, you link that with that. You do not link that with that. You do not see the gaps between You pick out on the groups of stars and you group them together, or we do. And this one, what do you see? Anyone, shout out what you see. Oh, nothing. Nothing.
6 groups of 3.
6 groups of 3, and yes, and how are the 6 groups arranged?
Adjacent and then below.
Yeah, you see it up and down, don't you? What you don't do is associate that with that with that, do you? You don't link them. You just link them this way, and these, and these, and these, and then these, and these, and these. And this is how you make sense of it. And there's an assumption that grouping is natural. It's a natural component of the mind. It's not learned. You didn't have to study for months and months and months to come up with that answer. Your mind alighted on it in spite of everything. Okay, you all get that. I shall come on, and it seems so obvious. You say, oh, why on earth? Of course we all know that. But it's the implication which is important. For the Gestaltists, we don't see individual stimuli as such. You didn't look and see one star, and then another star, and then another star, and think, what is the relationship between these stars? In fact, you hardly look at the individual stars. Because when we perceive the world, we perceive objects or stimuli in relation to each other. And this is something I mentioned about Gibson and his ecological theory of perception, and why it was a criticism of Locke. We see figures in terms of ground. Look at me for a moment. Just look at me. You can perceive me as a gestalt, as an object, but you don't perceive me in isolation. I'm not floating against a dark space. You pick me out against a background. You place me at a certain distance from yourself. There's a distance which you perceive as well. You couldn't just see me. It wouldn't be possible. And there's also an inclination to see good gestalts. That even if one of those stars which you saw had lost one of its prongs, you probably wouldn't notice it because you're looking at a pattern. I'm wearing dark things, clothes. If I'm standing here against a dark background, you might lose my elbow in relation to the background, but you still see me as having an elbow. You still, the mind closes down, closes up the gaps in the pattern, and it does it automatically. And why is this important? Because the Gestaltists were saying that the mind makes patterns, perceives patterns, and this is the opposite to breaking down things into their elements. And remember, when we started with Locke, Locke was an atomist and said the scientific approach is to break things down into their constituent parts. And he assumed that this is the way our minds work. We start with just seeing a tiny thing, and we put together the tiny things, and we create patterns, and science is a matter of putting together individuals. And to put together individuals, you have to break them down into the individuals. And the Gestaltists said, no, this is all wrong. The mind starts with the patterns, and to be scientific, you've got to look at the pattern of a whole, rather like Darwin did. The fundamental, comes from, I forgot to put who it was, it's from Wolfgang Köhler, the fundamental formula of Gestalt theory might be expressed in this way. There are wholes, the behaviour of which is not determined by that of their individual elements. What makes Happy Birthday a tune isn't that it has this note and this note, but where the part processes themselves are determined by the intrinsic nature of the whole, by the whole tune, by the whole relationship between the individuals. It is the hope of Gestalt theory to determine the nature of such wholes. The psychologist must look for the patterns, not break down the patterns into their constituent elements. If we want to put this in its historical context, we say this is much more Shaftesbury than Locke. Now, Shaftesbury claimed to try and work out the systems. He said, you can't study one person in isolation from another person. You can't study the person in isolation from the environment or the animals and so on. He also said that instinctively we have a sense of beauty or harmony. Actually, the Gestaltists were saying this. Our minds link things together. We want to see good gestalts, good patterns. And that the mind doesn't work out of perceiving individual things and then trying to put them together to make a pattern, as Locke had thought. And here is a big difference between Gestalt psychology and behaviourism. There's a difference, of course, of whether you're looking at the mind and talking about the mind or looking at behaviour. But it's also a difference between looking at the whole and trying to break down the whole into the parts. Because the behaviourists were often atomists of behaviour. What are the basic elements of behaviour? Oh, you reward something for moving the hand this way, and moving it this way and this way, rather than looking at what's the whole nature of behaviour. So you have a twofold distinction. One based on the object, whether it's behaviour or the mind, and the other whether it's the individual element a little bit, or whether it's the whole. And the Gestaltists were the whole, looking at the wholes of the mind. And therefore the Gestaltists said, actually science should build on this fundamental quality of the human mind. That science is the finding, the discovering of relationships between elements, not isolating units. Darwin would have said, yes, that's what his theory was doing, looking at the whole pattern, not just saying, oh, this species and that species and this species does this and this species does this, and we could train a pigeon in this way. He's saying, well, how does it all relate? And the Gestaltists were critical of many trends in experimental psychology. But many of the behaviourists were just saying, look, I can train a pigeon to do this. Look, I can train a rat to do that. Aren't I clever? And that just collecting facts for their own sake was leading to a trivial psychology. The individual fact has to be understood in relationship to other facts. We want to see the Gestalt, the patterning. And above all, seeking the laws of the mind, seeking the way the mind works on patterns. And the Gestaltists thought, if psychology ignores the mind, even though you can't see the mind, you can't pick up a mind, you can't observe the mind itself, you can only observe the effects of using your mind, it becomes trivial. The science which the behaviourists proclaimed was becoming a trivial science. And Gestalt psychology influence really gave birth to the modern movement of cognitive psychology, which has now become, and has for quite a number of years, the dominant force in modern psychology. And if cognitive psychologists talk about schemata or schema, these are talking about what the Gestaltists called a Gestalt, that the schema is a way of imposing a Gestalt on our experience. Schema are mental Gestalts. Now, I won't go into this greatly, but if behaviourism and Gestalt psychology are polar opposites, one looking inwards to the mind, the other looking outwards to behaviour, one breaking, saying we must look at wholes, the other trying to break things down, we would say that cognitive psychology, Gestaltism, really won because it's more influential today. Tomorrow it may not be, but today it is. But why? The important thing is, there never was a refutation of behaviourism. And behaviourism never refuted Wundt, and it never refuted Gestalt psychology. What happens is when the movement grows, it starts ignoring the other. Say, we're interested in this, we're going to look at this phenomenon, and we're not going to bother with that. So I say cognitive psychology took over many of the insights from Gestalt psychology. Cognitive psychology didn't refute behaviourism, although out of necessity the cognitives have to look at behaviour. If you're an experimental cognitive psychology, you can't say, oh, I'm going to put the mind on a table and observe what the mind does. You have to observe what people do. But you then infer from what they do that this is how their minds are working, how their cognitive schema are operating, how they use this schema rather than that schema. And the cognitive psychologists would say, there's nothing unscientific about this. Newton, take Newton. Would you think Newton was a scientist? And all cognitive psychologists would say, yes. What was one of the principal assumptions of Newton's theory? Was the operation of gravity. Can you see gravity? Can you pick up gravity? No, you watch something fall down. You see, you deduce the influence of gravity by watching other things. The cognitive psychologist, you say you deduce the presence of mental schemata by watching how people behave. But there are unresolved problems in modern psychology. Cognitive psychology, it claims to be a science. But at root, it's looking at unobservable things, representations, schemata. Just like Locke looked at ideas and thought he was being scientific, and Reid said, you can't see or touch an idea. Why assume it exists? And this is what the behaviourists said. And today, and here particularly at Loughborough, and you'll be taught by many of them, the discursive psychologists, they say, in a way that's similar to Darwin and Watson, the science should be based on what can be seen, on patterns of language. Don't assume that when you observe and listen to what people say, that this reflects some sort of mental schemata. No, watch what people do. And do not use the observable, as the Gestaltists did, as a way of studying the unobserved and unobservable mind. So the history of Gestaltism and the history of behaviourism raise this question: what should be the topic of psychology? Should it be observable things like behaviour, language use, or should it be unobservable things like the mind and mental representation, or even if we're a Freudian, like the unconscious, repressed wishes? There are two questions there. What should be the topic? Should it be observable or unobservable? Fundamental questions. Are you expecting me at this moment to put on another slide which will give you the answers to those questions? If you are, I'm going to disappoint you. There are no simple answers. Here we're asking a question. Questions about what sorts of psychology should there be? What sorts of assumptions should psychology have? And one thing which I wanted to emphasise is there's different sorts of psychologies with different histories. The answers to those questions, if they have answers, aren't going to come from me, aren't really going to come from the past. The past, the study of your past teaches you how to ask for questions. If they're going to be answers, as always, it should come from the next generation. So what I hope is these questions, or at least some of them, become important for some of you, and that you will formulate and try to formulate your own answers to them and move things forward. Because always, more important than the past, and certainly more important than the present, which of course William James said the present really doesn't exist as such, more important than the past is the future. You are the future, I'm not. But all I can do is tell you about the past, hoping that you create a future which is informed by the past. If you don't know about the past, there's a greater danger that you will repeat the mistakes of the past rather than building a better future. That's it. We'll break for a few minutes, and then on the hour I'll start the revision lecture, which will be the last actual lecture, but next week we have a review. Revision lecture. Now, before I start, I want to say something which I hope you'll all take into consideration. I do not have a good memory. Now, that can lead to problems. It can lead to the fact that you can come up and approach me in the corridor and I won't recognise your faces, and you'll think, what a rude person. But occasionally, not having a good memory can be a benefit. Actually, William James said, the road to wisdom is knowing what to forget. And this certainly is the case for a revision lecture. I would imagine that most of you will be thinking, as you attend to a revision lecture, about the exam which is to come in the new year. And you might think that if I stress this topic and seem to skate over that topic, that I'm giving a hint of what is to come in the exam. I'm not, because I can talk in a relaxed way in this lecture for the simple reason that I have totally forgotten what questions I have put on this year's exam. We set the exam a few weeks ago. I tended to the task, sent it off, and if if any of my colleagues were to say, what's on the paper? I'd say, oh, more or less the same as usual. I don't know. It's gone. So do not read into anything I say today as a hint of questions to come. Just take things, what I say, on their own merits. Will you do that? Otherwise you're going to mislead yourselves. And in this revision lecture, I hope to go over very briefly some of the main points, but please stop me at any point and say, go over that again. This year I didn't understand when you went through it and now you're summarising it, I still don't understand. The purpose of this revision lecture is to help you. Well, if you cast your mind back to the very start of the year, the first session, when you came in full of optimism after having had a relaxing summer or whatever, still with the with the effects of the sun on you, we started by talking about facts and what facts there might be in psychology and how there might be difficulties with finding established facts in psychology, and that this may put psychology on a different sort of scientific footing, if indeed it is a science, than something like chemistry. Ask university students studying chemistry, what are the facts of chemistry, and they'll look at you as if you're mad. Of course they're facts. Ask a psychology student, what are the facts of psychology? And we're struggling. So one way of approaching the questions I ended up with, was what constitutes a science? What would constitute a scientific psychology? And therefore I outlined the theory of Popper, that scientists don't prove theories. They test theories. They set up theories, and the theories should be testable. The theory should say what will happen and what won't happen. So if you're going to have a scientific theory of humans, it shouldn't just say, oh, we predict that humans will do this. They will think. It should also predict what won't happen. If it can't be tested, according to Popper, it's not a theory. And scientific knowledge, for Popper, are the best theories we have at the moment. The theories which haven't been refuted, which seem to explain things, but which potentially could be refuted. And Popper's beef against psychoanalysis was, you can't ever refute it. Whatever you say, oh, this seems to go against your theory, Professor Freud or one of his followers will say, no, if you look carefully enough, this confirms it. And for Popper, if the theory can absorb every sort of apparent contradiction, then it's not really scientific. Because in the 20th century, when Einstein and the theorists of relativity, Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, tested Newtonian physics, they found it wanting. But it couldn't explain the new facts which were emerging. Thomas Kuhn took Popper's ideas and said, that's all very well in theory, but it doesn't seem to work like this in practice. If you look at the history of science, you'll find that it's not a neat telling of a story of one theory working and then a new idea coming along, and the new idea showing the implausibilities of the old theory, and that we're constantly refuting the old theory, and we're constantly upgrading our knowledge because of conjectures, what Popper called conjectures and refutations. But sometimes some theories become popular for all sorts of reasons, and then they die down and another theory crops up. And you have a revolution in thinking, not because the old style, what Kuhn called a paradigm, the old way of doing science, was refuted. Just people got tired doing it that way. And in these various historical accounts which I've been giving, I've tried to suggest that actually the history of psychology in this respect is more Kuhn than Popper. Maybe it should be more Popper than Kuhn, but I don't think the historical record supports that. And that is one reason to look at the past, to understand this subject which you're studying now, and which some of you will contribute to in the future. But to understand the now, and indeed what is to come, you'll be in a much better position to understand where it's come from and the patterns of psychological knowledge in the past. And I started a long time ago with the English Civil War and Thomas Hobbes. Most history of psychology courses which are taught in psychology degrees probably will not start as long ago as I have. They may start in the 19th century and with the institutionalization of psychology. But I go back to the 1600s. If you were to ask me now, why have I gone back? Why did I go back so far? Wouldn't it have been better if I concentrated more on the later psychology? I would say perhaps it might have been better. But one thing which distresses me about modern education in this country is that history is no longer taught as if it's part of a core curriculum, as if it's important. I suspect for a number of you here, the story of the English Civil War was unfamiliar to you. So, I've tried to repair a bit of damage in modern education. And if I've been teaching you things which really you weren't interested in and wouldn't have chosen to learn, I can only do two things. One is to apologise and say, well, this reflects my view. And second, to say, I think it's good for your souls. A psychologist talking about soul? Your souls? Do you know what the word psyche means, which is the first part of the word psychology? Does anyone? You've used this word psychology without even inquiring the history of the word and its meaning. But ology at the end comes from the Greek logos, which is like study. It's actually logos means word. It's written study. The psyche is the soul. It's the study of the soul. But in the modern period, it's become the study of the mind. It's become the study of behaviour. It's become soulless. And Hobbes, he was a soulless man, a sceptic. And I tried to relate his scepticism to the age in which he lived. A dreadful time of suspicion, where it was a time full of high-minded people who were putting others to death. And Hobbes said, behind all that display of high-mindedness and sanctimoniousness, you often would detect selfish, untrusting motives. Our sense of morality is based on selfishness, and this is why order needs to be imposed on people, because individually we just pursue our own ends unless we were forced to attend to others. And Hobbes looked at the mind, how we formulate ideas, and he saw no evidence for goodness. And later theorists of the mind said, where is the error in Hobbes? Is Hobbes right? If Hobbes is right, isn't this dreadful? We are such an awful, awful species. And Locke, he was trying to find the error in Hobbes. And he started from the assumption, we have knowledge. We can be scientific. And he wanted to be scientific. He admired Newton. He admired the great scientists of his day. And what was science according to Locke? It was based on observation, looking at things. The mind is blank at birth, according to Locke. Why was this so important to him? Because if the mind is blank at birth, then where does our knowledge come from? It comes from our senses. It comes from perception. It comes from outside. That the idea that science is empirical then matches, according to Locke, the nature of humans. Don't trust past authorities. Trust your senses. Observe. That is the way to knowledge. But then there was a dilemma. A real fundamental dilemma, which was to be devil followers of Locke from that day onwards. Think of it this way. The mind is empty at birth. Everything we know comes from our senses, from outside, through our senses, through our brains, through our minds. Does this mean that we perceive the world as it is, or that we can only perceive the world according to the structures of our minds? That what we think is going on in the world must reflect the structure of the human mind, because all our knowledge comes from the mind. Now, it wasn't that Locke overlooked this. He thought he could resolve the dilemma based on a simple theory of perception, which says we perceive the world as it is. Perception, if you might remember, he said, was a passive process, meaning we open our eyes, the world as it actually is floods in. It floods in and forms ideas in our mind. And then we start playing with the ideas, putting them together, what he said, reflecting on them. And he talked about cognitive processing. Well, he didn't use the word cognitive processing, but this is what a modern cognitive psychologist would say, cognitive processing. And this is why at the root of what he was saying is this fundamental theory of perception of being simple and true and passive. Now, this is fundamental for understanding Locke. You won't really understand Locke's theory unless you get that point. And I am perfectly prepared to break off from my prepared schedule and go over it again if anyone asks me to. If anyone hasn't quite got it. Do you all think you've got the importance of the passive theory of perception in Locke to his understanding of the human mind? I shall pause. There is no humiliation in raising a hand and saying, go over that again. Okay. And much of what I've been talking about subsequently, like in this lecture from the Gestalt, is saying, Locke, nice try, John. But the mind doesn't quite work like that. Perception doesn't operate like that. And there were the clues in Locke himself. We see, and then we reflect. We put together. But where does this power to reflect and put together to come? Maybe that's innate. Maybe that's part of the mind. And why should we assume that the simple, the accurate perception comes first? Maybe as we perceive, so we're grouping, so we're putting things together, so we are sorting out what is happening now than what is a memory. And the critics of Locke drew on this. They drew on a number of things. And two particular critics I talked about. One was Shaftesbury, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. And he said that Locke's analysis of the mind, going into smaller and smaller mental processes, where our ideas come from, how we put them together, was taking an increasingly trivial look at humans. The big patterns were important. Shaftesbury was holistic. Holistic is someone who wants to see the whole and put the part in terms of the whole. The atomist, like Locke, wants to break down the whole into its parts. Look at the big picture, according to Shaftesbury, the relationship of one person to another. Yes, we have a sense of community. Yes, we're born with a social instinct. We're not isolated individuals, as Hobbes and then Locke thought. If we want to understand the mind, don't just imagine one mind in isolation and then try and break that mind down to its own key constituents. We don't live in isolation. We live together. We have common sense, a sense of community, an innate social sense. In fact, we'd never grow up if we didn't. He also said we have an innate moral sense, an innate aesthetic sense. And how do we think? We don't think by comparing perceptions. We as humans think by using language, by debating, by having dialogue. And he gave advice to anyone who wanted to write, and I think his advice is useful to this day, to all of you. When you write an essay, if you want to write something, first of all, imagine you're talking about it, and you're talking about it to someone who doesn't really believe. Have a debate in your own mind. Try and answer the questions, the justification, the criticisms which might be made of what you're trying to write. And if you set up this mental debate, what you write afterwards will be stronger. And that implies that thinking is something not established by the individual mind in isolation, but is social. It's through debate, through questioning, through criticism, through justification, that we refine our thoughts and make our thinking better. It's not just, as Locke said, matching a general idea to a specific perception. And then there was the other criticism from Thomas Reid, a very different man to Shaftesbury. Much more religious thinking man. Shaftesbury's religious views were uncertainly, probably was not a Christian in his beliefs. And Reid was worried that the way of analysing the mind, which Locke had instituted, and which was to become popular for another 200 years, was leading to scepticism, because Locke's theory of perception was false. Take away Locke's theory of perception, and you're left with the idea that what we have is just our views, our ideas on the world. And these ideas may reflect the structure of the human mind rather than the structure of the world. Because there's the world, here's our mind, whatever we know about the world must come through the mind, and maybe our minds are ordered in such a way that we can only see the world as our minds tell us to see the world, and that really the world is very different. And Reid wanted to find the error. He said, no. If we think that, this is the way to scepticism, saying, but we can never know the world. We only know what we think we know. And Reid said the basic error of Locke is to put his faith in this notion of ideas. But we know our ideas. And Reid said the notion of an idea is a fanciful notion. Here is Locke trying to be scientific, and he said science operates by formulating ideas. What is an idea? I've never seen one, he said. I've never touched one. You say there's ideas in the brain. Cut open the brain and all you see is tissue. You don't see an idea. Someone at the anatomy table cuts through the skull. Do ideas rush out of the corpse like butterflies? No. Instead of saying we see ideas of the world, Reid said perception is simple. We see the world. This is the world as we see. Don't say we see ideas of the world, we see the world. And part of seeing is also conceiving. Perception without conception, this would be a modern way of putting it. Reid didn't quite put it like this, but this was the idea, is impossible. We see objects. We presume the objects exist outside us. We cannot stop ourselves with assuming that the objects are beyond us. This is what it means to see the world. We have direct knowledge of the world. And I made a parallel between Reid's theory of perception, which is different from Locke's, and in the modern age of J.J. Gibson's, his ecological perception, which is perception isn't a passive process. We're always searching out for information. Our eyes are moving backwards and forwards all the time. We're looking to get different views on things. We're not even aware necessarily we're searching out for information. And Gibson says We see the world. Don't say we just have images of the world. We see the world. So I'd outlined Locke's theory, Hobbes' theory, Shaftesbury's, I won't say theory, it was his view. And to illustrate this, I used the concrete problem of humour, because otherwise things just get too abstract. And humour, for Hobbes, a nasty thing. Yeah, you just laugh at people. You think you're being witty, but really it's what gives us the pleasure is feeling superiority to others who are having misfortunes, particularly if they're people who put themselves above us, and then if they slip over in the mud, oh, isn't it funny? Locke, trying to get away from the nastiness of Hobbes' vision of humans, says, oh, well, humour, it's not that important. It's just fancy, it's like metaphor. It's treating different ideas, different concepts, as if they're similar and doing for fun and getting a smile out of it. But really, the real business of the mind is trying to find differences between things which we assume to be similar. That's what science does, it finds differences between things. And what the humorist does is find similarities, rather like the poet. And Locke really is taking humour not in respect to the sort of dirty jokes you can find on the internet so readily. He's doing it in terms of rather amusing wit and metaphor and rather nice. Shaftesbury didn't have a theory of humour. He wasn't interested in what makes us laugh. In fact, he assumed that most people, the common people, laugh for most inappropriate reasons. He wasn't interested in ungentlemanly humour, but the function of humour. And here's an important thing, that some psychologists are interested in function. Darwin was going to be interested in function. Would the world be different if this mental process didn't exist? And Shaftesbury said yes. The function of humour is not just to provide merriment, a little fancy as Locke seemed to think, or reassurance to the insecure as Hobbes seemed to think. It's hugely important if we're to use our brains to think. By mocking ideas, we test them. An idea which cannot withstand mockery is an idea not worth having. And that's why he said the religious zealots always say, don't mock my ideas. My ideas are too important to mock. The tyrants say, don't mock me. And for Shaftesbury, and it's a very modern idea, written in the 18th century, the early years of the 18th century, a very modern idea, that tyrants want to clamp down on satire, on mockery. Why? Not just to impose their own rule, because the tyrant is scared of thinking. The tyrant wants to stop people thinking. For Shaftesbury, thinking, dialogue, free dialogue, and mockery, satire, laughter are all keys to human freedom. But there's a gap. In some ways, Shaftesbury's theory of humour is it's not really a theory, its function is a bit high-minded, although it's based on mockery. There's something missing. Hobbes had raised this issue of what is the importance of emotion in human life. And the other thinkers were skirting around this. And then we come to Darwin, who transformed how people thought about human nature. No place for the deity, saying God created us. Ask the question, how did we come into being? What is the history, not of this society, or that society, or this individual, or that individual, but what is the history of the whole species? And what is the history of other species? What is the history of the world before anyone could write a history? His early life, I told you about it, he went on the Beagle, trying to make sense of the rocks, the fungi, the nature, the animals which he saw. And asking the great question, how did these species come into existence? Why are these species different from each other? And why did some species go out of existence? Why don't we have woolly mammoths today? What is the relationship of the elephant to the woolly mammoth? And so he formulated his great theory of evolution. And I forgot to tell you something. In The Origin of Species, there's the theory, but he never used the word evolution. He talked about natural selection rather than evolution. It was later in The Descent of Man that he started talking about evolution. And natural selection works as nature works, like the horse breeder, of a dog breeder, of a plant breeder, but does it spontaneously. Each species produces too many offspring. The majority die. This is why the theologians had problems with Darwin. It wasn't because he said, oh, we're descended from monkeys, or the world is many years older than it appears in the creation story. The Victorian theologians had problems with Darwin because he seemed to say that if there's a God, it's a cruel God who creates so many animals just to die. Too many babies of each species just die. And this is necessary if a species is to adapt, because at any time it needs those who are most equipped to adapt to the environment in which the species is living to survive, and those who are not adapted to die and not reproduce. And the assumption was, in having this surplus of life, not all the individuals who were born would be similar. There'd be differences. And the most adapted would survive, and if the most adapted survive, then they in turn breed and give rise to more adapted, and so always a species is in the process of changing, as the adapted survive and the non-adapted don't survive. Change the environment, and you change who needs to survive. The woolly mammoth might have been adapted for the Ice Age, but when the temperature started heating up, all that woolliness, all that hairiness which protected the woolly mammoth, all that fat under the hairiness, just made the species too hot, and it would be the thinner ones, the less woolly ones, which would survive. If you think that at the moment the world is changing through the short-sightedness of humans, but the climate is changing, the ecology is changing, this will change, according to Darwin, the conditions for adaptation for other species. We're already seeing it. When I was a boy, I grew up in London. The most common bird, which you see thousands upon thousands of them everywhere, was sparrows. You hardly see a sparrow now. Why? We don't quite know, but the conditions of adaptation have changed. And the same may be true for humans. Change our environment, and we change who may be best adapted to it. But it is certainly true for the animal kingdom. But Darwin didn't mention humans in The Origin of Species, but he most certainly did in The Descent of Man, where he said that humans inherit both physical and mental characteristics. One of the mental characteristics, and this idea was taken up by the great Noam Chomsky, is that humans have inherited the capacity to speak, to have language. And for this reason, Darwin said that the differences between different types of humans are just surface differences. That we must have all evolved as a species together, and then we travel over different parts of the globe and living in hot climates. Well, a particular colour skin may have developed as a protection, and living in cold climates, a different colour skin might have evolved, and a different body shape and so on. But these were just surface characteristics. The real fundamental nature of being human, being able to use language and having emotions, would have evolved before. And in Darwin's theory of the emotions, he points to similarities between humans all over the world, wherever they live, and also certainly similarities between humans and the higher animals, higher mammals. Why we bare our teeth and clench our muscles when we're angry. Because that was a good way of showing aggression to a particular predator. And Darwin, his method was observation, looking at the world. Not doing experiments, but looking. He looked at his own children and wrote about it. He looked at animals, he looked at plants. Looking at animals behaving in their natural environment. The children in the environment of the Darwin household. Not saying, oh, we can't trust these observations, we have to put them in an experimental situation. And for Darwin, inherited behaviour, and he didn't have a theory of genetics, he didn't quite know how inheritance worked, but he knew it was there. Inherited behaviour was often, but not always, more important than learnt behaviour, because we inherit the story of our species. We are what we are because of what has happened millions of years ago. But we are not static as a species. Continually we're having to adapt. And his cousin, Francis Galton, took this up as the main theme of his psychology. We evolved under a particular set of circumstances where unfit children died. Oh, cruel it might be. But it led to the breeding of superior humans, and humans are superior to all other animals. And much to Galton's worry, medicine which had been produced by this higher species was enabling the unfit to survive. The wrong people were breeding in Galton's imagination. This was the fundamental fear living behind his notion of eugenics. And Galton's psychology was built upon this eugenic vision. And he was a genius. This is what is disturbing about Galton. He invented statistics to show how correlations were occurring, to show how regression was occurring. The best were breeding and having not so good. He used his statistics to try and show the differences between individuals, the differences between populations, and for him often the differences between populations were differences between race, and he took the concept of race as if it is a scientific term. And above all, this fear that the human species, which Darwin had said evolved onwards and upwards, had reached its peak and now was going down because we were letting the wrong people breed. A dark vision, but the true darkness of this vision was not to be revealed in Galton's own lifetime, but in the last third of the 20th century, when a particular government adapted the eugenic vision and put it at the basis of its politics. I'm referring, of course, to the Nazi regime. And it's often forgotten that the first people whom the Nazis systematically murdered were the mentally deficient and the physically deficient, who were gassed earlier before the racial gassings. A lesson to us all that once you start saying these sorts of people are not fit to live, then you're down a slippery road of saying these sorts of people should be killed, and anyone who doesn't contribute to the betterment of the species should be killed. And the disturbing element of Galton is, and the disturbing lesson of Galton is, he was a scientist. And scientific ideas about human beings can sometimes grip the imagination and produce a vision which is so dangerous that it must make us distrust putting our faith in science. And then I went from the dangerous to the very worthy, but rather tedious Wilhelm Wundt, the father of experimentation, who believed that it was possible to have a science of experience. And he based it around the study of what has sometimes been called just noticeable differences, asking people, can you feel the difference in weight between this and this? And noticing that people could feel, but the differences were not absolute differences, they were relative differences. And the different sense modalities had different sensitivities. Two very heavy weights, one just an ounce lighter than the other. If they're very heavy, you won't distinguish the two. But if they're very light, an ounce, yes, it's easy to distinguish. And Wundt showed how you could do experiments which tried to look at consciousness and the effect of varying stimuli systematically on conscious perception. But one thing which Wundt said is, many of the thoughts which we have, what is in our minds, much of what is in our minds, is also socially produced, is historically produced. But all of you might judge lights or sounds similar to how people might have done 400 years ago, but you don't think in the same way. What you consider important, your sense of morality, how you behave to other people, it's all different. And so social and historical processes were also important for a social psychology. And for Wundt, you can't study these by experiment. William James, I came on to, rebelled against Wundt. Thought Wundt was an old stickler, much warmer, more humane sense of human beings. Psychologised what it felt like to be a human being, what it felt like to get out of bed in the morning, to put on your trousers in the morning, which led you, we have habits which we hardly notice. And we often don't think about what we're doing. But our minds don't work as if you have one mental state and move to another mental state. Look at your own minds, how they flow, how your thoughts wander. It's like a stream. And it's a moot point whether the great insights of William James could have come from experiments, or whether there's insights about humans which you get not from experiments. The experiments teach you little bits, but the great insights come from a great imagination and someone who looks and thinks and feels. Freud was similar in this respect, but unlike James, he said, look to the unconscious, what you hide from yourself. Actually, Freud and James met. Freud only visited America once, and he met James. And it seems like they both liked each other, they respected each other. Freud thought James was an incredibly brave man. James took him for a walk in the woods, and he knew that James had a weak heart, but James strode out totally fearless, and Freud thought this was the way to face death. James thought Freud was an interesting fellow, not a standard psychologist. He thought he was obsessed with sex and thought, well, his theory indicates his obsession, but also thought he was right in saying, look to what we do or what we're not really conscious of. What is at the margins of experience? But I concentrated on Freud's theory of jokes, which I think fills in some of the gaps which Hobbes, Locke and Shaftesbury don't get. Hobbes, maybe according to Freud's theory, slightly right, but many of our jokes, the things we laugh at, have a rather dubious side. Freud said, yes, we have a tendentious jokes, but some of the jokes we laugh at because they deal with things we can't say openly. But Freud also said, look and analyse how a joke works. It's not just the inner motive, it's also the outer play with words, the outer structure. But a clever structure plus a hidden motive, that leads to the biggest laughter. But no one admits it. We all claim we laugh because it's funny. Therefore we have hidden secrets in our laughter. And then last week I went back to experimentalism and the rise of experiments and that the rise of experimental psychology also saw the demise of the Wundt-type experiment. Wundt's experiments are very different from the experiments which you were taught. They don't use statistical data. The observer was often the experimentalist, or what we would now call the experimentalist. The observer, the person who was looking at their experiences, their own experiences, was a respected, trained figure. It wasn't a matter of drumming up anonymous subjects. Experimenters and observers swap places. And as part of the lecture, I was arguing that although we see the rise in the 20th century of the sort of experiment which uses statistics and, and anonymous subjects and the decline of the Wundt experiment, there never was a refutation of Wundt and his sort of experiment. It's as if fashions change. And I took up this theme in today's lecture with the behaviourists and with the Gestaltists. And I'm not going to go over today's lecture because it still should be so fresh. But it's the difference between whether we study the mind or outward behaviour, or whether we study outward behaviour as an indication of the mind and of mental processes, or study outward behaviour as just outward behaviour. Or whether we look for the wholes, the wider pattern, or try and break down each wider pattern into small little elements. And so, you might say, as I come to the end of the teaching part, it's all been unsatisfactory. It hasn't taught me what's true. What is the real method? It's just ended with questions. Should we look at behaviour? Should we look at experience? Should we do Wundt experiments? Should we do traditional experiments with their control groups? Should we not do experiments? Should we just observe? Come on, Billig, tell us what is the truth. I can't. I don't know. I know the questions. Sometimes, for humans, it's the ability to formulate the question which counts for more than a claimed answer. If I just said, there is one way of doing psychology, and this is the best way, you might write it down. It might be simpler. But in my view, it would be a lie. The purpose of this course is not to tell you the truth. And here is where I join with Popper, absolutely. It's to tell you how to ask questions, the importance of the questions, and to look to see where the questions have come from. And if you can be clear about the questions, then you might be in a better way, a better position, just to advance slowly, cautiously, and sometimes with a great leap of imagination and faith towards an answer. That's why I shall look forward to reading your exam answers, because they should be your answers.